Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Once again, another SWI, a still worth it video, and today we're going to be talking about none other than the iPhone 5. This phone is a legend in its own league. It's its own phone in my opinion. And the thing with the iPhone 5 is that, it was released in 2012, and at that time, this phone was still, it was a smaller phone without a doubt, especially when we had like the Galaxy Notes and the Galaxy S series phones, but a lot of people at this time still were not even complaining about the size of the phone for the most part, mostly because Apple increased the size of this phone. They went from a 3.5 inch screen on the iPhone 4S to a 4 inch screen on the iPhone 5. Now, I find it kind of funny because they called it the iPhone 5 even though it had a 4 inch screen, so I'm not really too sure what they did there. And they never released a phone with a 5 inch screen. They've always been higher than that, but regardless, that's besides the point. Now, back in 2012, dude, this phone, was the flagship of the time, and it's funny looking at it now, especially in the later part of 2019. We've got the new iPhones, we've got the new OS versions, and looking at this phone, dude, it's pretty insane how fast technology was moving. Now, we've kind of been stagnant a little bit, I'm not gonna lie, but regardless, this phone still has a blessing. It's a great phone, has my blessings for sure. So looking on the front, like I've stated, a 4 inch IPS panel, and it's not the sharpest thing in the world, but for 2012 phone, dude, that's not even an OLED panel. It's not a bad panel at all in my opinion. It's still held up pretty well throughout time. The resolution is 640 by 1136, and what I find funny is that 326 pixels per inch on this panel, that is the same amount of PPI on the iPhone 11, including the iPhone XR, and I find that pretty crazy. Like, they still haven't increased that at all, which is so weird. I'm sure they'll increase it next year, but regardless, 326 pixels per inch, I'm sure they could do better, and potentially the iPhone SE2 that's coming out next year will also have around that same PPI, which again is kind of weird. I'm not too sure what they're doing there, but regardless, it's a pretty decent panel still, and it's kind of still relevant in today's standards because of that pixels per inch. But on the front, you can see a lot of bezel on it. There's only like a 60% screen to body ratio on it, which is kind of funny. Like, we have phones that have like no bezel at all, and there's phones that are like the size of this phone can fit in the screen of many other phones nowadays because of the low amount of bezels. Single camera on the back, lightning port and headphone jack on the bottom, and what I can tell you, regardless, dude, this phone still feels extremely premium. Like some phones nowadays, like I've held like the BlackBerry Key 1 and even the Google Pixel 2 and 3, like those phones feel premium for sure, but like this phone feels way more premium than those, and I find that super surprising. The fact that this phone came out way before those phones and that one still feels way more premium than many other phones that came out even just in today's standards even like a year or two ago. So pretty crazy stuff there in my opinion, and no IP certification, no removable card slots, no removable battery, anything like that. And ultimately, what I can tell you is in terms of the outside, I think it's held up pretty well. It doesn't feel like a cheap phone still, and I still feel like it's kind of relevant. And the funniest thing is because for like the last year, 2 years ago, since iOS 11 came out, this phone wasn't getting software updates. It stopped at iOS 10. But the funniest thing is, and why it's even funnier to make this video now, is that randomly out of the blue, the iPhone 5 got a software update for iOS 10.3.4, I believe it was. The 4S also got that update as well. And what's so funny about that is that we went like 2 years without a single update on this phone. It was still getting updates in the App Store and everything, but for the most part, this phone was pretty much dead silent. And what's so funny about that is that last year when I did my video, there was no, I didn't make any hints on a software update. Early this year when I did that 2019 video, still no updates or anything because there were no updates, but now we randomly got one 2 years later. So in terms of that, I'm pretty sure that's where it's going to end. No more software updates. If it does get another software update, it's going to be a security update. It's not going to go and randomly be like, oh, iOS 11 or iOS 14 on it. So it's done with software for the most part. It's going to get security updates here and there. What I will tell you though is that you're still able to get a lot of updates through the App Store. So what I would recommend you to do is if you still have an iPhone 5 or whatever, you can still get most of the apps through the App Store. However, if you want to install an unsupported app, I have a tutorial on my channel somewhere you can search through, or you can just type in my name in the YouTube search bar and then type in how to install unsupported apps, and it'll be like the first video, so do that one. And that's exactly how to install unsupported apps on your iPhone 5. For the most part, it's not getting software updates, so that does kind of suck, but at the end of the day, iOS 10 was pretty decent, and it still is kind of secure for the most part, so you can still use it if you want to. It's not the most secure thing, not the most up-to-date thing, but Apple does take pretty decent care of their older devices. So that pretty much covers that up in terms of the software side of things. Let's go and talk about the performance side of things. Now, this thing has the Apple A6 chip, a dual-core CPU, and 1GB of RAM on all three models. There was a 16GB, 32GB, and 64GB model. It's kind of funny now because the top-tier model of storage for this phone is like the bottom-tier storage of a lot of the phones being developed now. And even if we say that a phone has 64 gigs for a base model, we complain about that now too because it's like so low, but this one was a top tier model of that time. And what I can tell you in terms of the performance, not a bad performing device still for the time being when it was released and for how old it is and for what it brought. In 2012, I don't think a lot of people were saying this was the fastest phone, but with that being said, when it was on iOS 6, a lot of people were saying it was blazing fast. It was like the fastest iPhone, which it was at the time. But once iOS 7 came out and all those updates came out after the fact, a lot of people were complaining about the sluggish performance. And I think they kind of gotten better and better since then. I think with iOS 10, it was pretty decent. But I know back in iOS 6 days, people were saying it was very, very good performance around the board. But then with iOS 7, it kind of clunked up in iOS 8 and iOS 9 thereafter. But right now on iOS 10.3.4, it's not a bad performing device for for a 7-year-old device. App's still open, it still gets me from point A to point B for the most part. Really the only slight inconvenience is the unsupported apps thing. I cannot download a lot of things straight from the App Store. I usually have to either plug it into a computer or do my method that I've done before. But it's just like one extra thing I have to do, which kind of is an annoyance. And on top of that, not all the updates are straight from the App Store. So if you download Temple Run or like Gmail, for example, you can only go up to a certain amount of updates until it's cut off for that phone, which kind of sucks. So you're not getting updates for a while, or at all for that matter. But in terms of the performance of the apps that are supported and everything, it's pretty good, for, like I said, for the time being. Small apps open up fine. Safari, you can go scroll through things, and I think that's a pretty decent performance overall. Once you kind of take it up a notch, the main thing you'll notice is that the app loading speeds are so slow. It takes so long for a phone of this caliber to load up an app. Like with Temple Run, it takes so long, and that's such a minor game. Once you go into like the more, intensive things, that's when things start super taking a toll. Real Racing 3, things like that, those you tend to see those being super slow altogether. Even on phones like the iPhone 6, it's a little bit sluggish, but a phone like this, dude, I can tell you, it's very, very slow. And I don't want to hate on it too much because, of course, it's an older phone. I know it brought a lot to the table and everything, but in terms of the performance, man, it definitely doesn't hold up as well nowadays. But when you factor in the aspect that it is a 7-year-old device, that it did, go through all these software updates, that it isn't the newest thing anymore, then I think you kind of give it a little bit of leeway. So in terms of that performance, it's probably like a 3 out of 10 right now, but factoring in all those like year, how old it is and everything and what it brought to that table, it's like a 6 out of 10 in my opinion. Okay, now that kind of covers up the performance side of things. Let's go and talk about the camera. Now this thing has a single 8 megapixel camera on the back. You can do 1080p videos on it, which is awesome. No slow-mo videos or anything like that got brought in with the iPhone 5s. And I can tell you the same thing with the camera. Like, it's a pretty decent camera for the time being that it was released. Audio quality wasn't that great when you're recording videos on it, but for the most part, it's not a bad sensor. If you're outdoors, you can probably do a pretty decent job at taking certain photos and the perfect lighting conditions and everything. Low light photos aren't really that good. Outdoor photos are pretty good for how old this phone is, but you're missing out on like portrait mode, night mode, all those different things. 4K videos, even at 4K 60 frames, you're missing out on all those things. And the front camera, 1.2 megapixels, only HD video 720p, which it's not bad for the time being for this phone was being released. But nowadays, we can do 4K on that front camera of the iPhone 11. So we've seen some pretty big strides. We've seen some pretty big improvements, but for this phone specifically, I probably wouldn't recommend using the camera. But again, it's like, it'll get you the job. It'll get the job done. It's not that big of a deal. So for seeing how it is now, of course, I don't think anybody's purposely going to be picking up this camera to use it, but I don't think it's a horrible camera either. And I think, I got to give a respect for still kind of having a camera that you can use in the beginning with. So that pretty much covers that up. Now, in terms of the battery life, this thing has a 1440 milliamp hour battery. And you know what? The thing is that even though this thing is older, it's definitely, the battery's degraded. It's probably at like 900 milliamp hours at this point. iOS 10 wasn't really too bad at sucking up battery in my opinion. But on top of that, the parts to repair this phone are super, super cheap. You can pick up a battery for this thing for probably like $10 and replace it yourself and not even have any detrimental effects to your phone. Even if you're a novice, I would obviously tell you to follow a tutorial and everything. But for the most part, dude, if you get an iPhone 5, if you want to repair the screen, if you want to get a new camera, if you want to do whatever, you can easily replace it for the most part. And that's what I love so much about this phone. It's so easy to replace this phone, to repair parts of this phone. And for the battery, even though it's not removable technically per se, you can still replace it pretty easily if you even know a little bit about unscrewing something and plugging things back in. So Battery on stock is not that good, but once you get a new battery, it can get a little bit better. It's still probably below average, but it'll get the job done for the most part. Now, kind of factoring in everything together and kind of summing up this whole entire video, what I can tell you is this phone is a legend. It's a legendary phone. It brought so much to the table, and it brought that bigger size screen. The first time we saw an increase in size. No Touch ID, but it brought a pretty decent camera. It stayed with us for a long time until iOS 10, and it still got the software update, and this is one of the longest lasting iPhones to get software updates, technically speaking. So that actual title goes to the 4S, but what I can tell you, man, without a doubt, I like this phone a lot. I probably wouldn't recommend people buying it. Again, I would recommend people going for the iPhone 6S at the bare minimum. That's the lowest point I would recommend people going. But for the most part, I like the iPhone 5. It brought a lot to the table, and I have nothing but respect for this phone. So that pretty much covers that. If you have any questions or anything, leave it down in the comment section below. Hit that like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it would mean so much if you guys could hit that. Also, check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my second channel, all those links are linked down below. I'd really appreciate it if you guys could check it out. But more importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.